Hello, bookish friends. It's Natalie, and this is On the Same Page. I'm coming at you this week with my January reading wrap-up. So all the books that I read in January, of which there were 14, which seems like a lot. And I was thinking about it, and I realized that it might have been because in January I actually took like a small vacation. In the cold. So there was a lot of like downtime and like reading time. So this is a little bit more than your average month, but makes for a good video as I have a lot to discuss. So might as well get into it. So first off, I actually won a Goodreads giveaway in December for this arc, Tell Me How to Be by Neil Patel. And with the craziness of the holidays, I was not able to get started reading it until like the first week of January. But it was my first book of 2022. And I really liked it. It was really good. I was very impressed with like his writing style. I really liked like his messaging, the way he organized the story. It was basically kind of split narrative following both Ashok and his mother, Renu. And so Ashok has not come out to his family, who is like, you know, like more traditional immigrant family. Yeah, he's nervous that like his relationship like with his mother like will be harmed because of that. And basically he's coming home for the first time like in quite a while, because he has like strained relations like with his family, but he's coming home for like a celebration memorial type event for his father, who had died like about 1 year ago. And he's going to go see his mother, who has also just recently sold their house and is going to be moving back to London. You get these kind of like very reflective moments where his mother is kind of thinking about like her life and how it's like led up to this point. Kind of like disillusionment about like being married and like you know, now that she's kind of viewing this like second chapter for her life, like how she's revisiting the past and how it's shaped her as like a person. And then you also have the main character, Ashok. I would say he's more of the main character. And he's kind of just trying to get his feet under him like professionally, and has been kind of like suffering from a series of like pitfalls leading up to that point. And so he's disappointed, or he is nervous that his family is disappointed in him. And, you know, the added stress of like going back to like your hometown and really like not having made a name for yourself. But I don't know, it was really great. The stories were kind of parallel to each other, and I really appreciated the ending a lot. So this was like quite a good read, and I was very impressed by it. Next up, I have a Spindle Splintered, which is a kind of like novella by Alix Harrow. And this book was a retelling of Sleeping Beauty, and in this story, you know, it is like gender bending, it is like more modern, like retelling, but basically it's about a girl who has kind of like always idolized the story of Sleeping Beauty because she herself has like a degenerative and eventually will be terminal disease, and has lived with it like her entire life. She's turning 21 at the beginning of the book, which is longer than anyone thought that she was going to live. And Sleeping Beauty has always been like kind of a comfort to her, because although she is sick in the beginning of the book, or at the beginning of the tale, eventually she is completely healed like by true love's kiss, and is able to like, you know, continue on as if nothing has happened. So she's kind of like always idolized the story. And basically her friend throws her like a 21st birthday party complete with like spinning wheel. And so as like a joke, she like pricks her finger on the spindle and is basically thrown out of time into another realm that is actually like a fairy tale realm, where she meets Sleeping Beauty and is trying to like, help her change the end of her own story. And, you know, she learns a lot about herself like along the way. Her phone still works in like the other realm, which is like a little bit bizarre for me. Which I guess leads into my main critique of this, which is that I felt like the tone of the book was like a little off and it didn't land as well for me. You know, I do appreciate like a good urban fantasy. I do like when like modern people are like thrown into like a bizarre fantasy world. But for this one, I think just like it was a little bit too like weirdly irreverent in like tone, and I feel like that like kind of grated on me in spots. But overall, like great messaging. I like what she did with like expanding upon the story. And I mean, it is a novella, so it is like a nice and quick, easy read for someone who's looking for like a different spin on fairy tale retelling. Next, I read a nonfiction book, which I've been trying to read more of. My goal is to do like one of these a month. But I read The Serpent and the Rainbow, which is actually one of my fiance's books. And because I've also been trying to read more of his books, like interspersed with my own, just because I feel like I want to have read more of his books. He has like so many of them like filtered in like around the apartment. One of my own like things that I've been trying to work through is reading more of like his books and not just like the books that I own. So anyways, this book is basically based off of a PhD like project that the author, Wade Davis, who was like a Harvard post-grad student. And in the 80s, he basically took a trip down to Haiti to follow up like research on, there was this kind of like crazy story that he heard, and his benefactors basically wanted his like input as like a botanist and anthropologist, where a person had been presumed dead and then like a few weeks or like a few days later was basically found to be alive, and you know he had like kind of enemies, and he was like back on the scene, and they wanted to probe into some of like the voodoo rituals and customs, and also the possibility of like plants that could be used to make someone like appear dead or bring someone back to life. So basically he, you know, created his hypothesis. He was looking at like different poisons that are like native to the area, different like plants that could be like ingested and thus like be poisonous. And then he wanted to basically do like an anthropological research into like the voodoo culture and like secret societies and all this stuff. The book was really interesting. It read a little bit like Indiana Jones-ish, I'm not gonna lie. He also brought up Indiana Jones because I feel like it was like a tongue-in-cheek moment, and it is like an older book, so I'm not sure like sensitivity-wise, like these days, like it would probably be written like a little bit differently. But overall, a very interesting read. I learned a lot about like the slave revolution in Haiti that I had no idea of personally, so I feel like that was a ton of history that I didn't know about. And it was like super interesting to read about all of the different like poisons, and you know like the biology of it all. So it was pretty interesting, and also a pretty like quick read. So that was that one. Next, I read The Atlas Six, which is obviously like a super hyped book recently, and is this like self-published novel, and I got it for Christmas, which is like really fun. And this book was really great. I feel like I was expecting a lot because it had such great reviews, and I would say like it did like live up to the hype. If I had to say anything, I would say that there was a little bit too much focus on the characters to the point where the plot itself was like a little tenuous, especially like towards the last 2/3 of the book. I feel like you're so wrapped up in the characters, and they are like very engrossing, and like the relationships that they have to each other is like, you know, like super, super interesting. But I would say at some points I'm like, what is actually even happening like in this book, aside from all of these characters like having these different relationships and like struggles in terms of like coming out on. As someone who is consistently reading like I would say like heavy world building fantasy, just because I like things to be logical even when they are fantastical. So I feel like that being said, like I was a little bit frustrated like at times with this book, just because things didn't necessarily make as much sense as I would have liked them to. The basic premise of the story is that There are these characters who are, you know, like a couple of them are like just graduating high school, and there are people who are a little bit older, so like, you know, like 25, 26-ish age. And they all get basically picked to be a part of this like quote fellowship project. Basically, you know, just like researchers paid by like a secret organization, because in this realm, the Library of Alexandria does exist. It holds like all of the secrets to like a bunch of magic, and there is this like secret organization that's in charge of appointing people to continue researching and take care of the library and protect it from like invaders. So basically protect the knowledge of the ages. But at the end of a year, only 5 of them are allowed to continue, or are picked to continue to be like the protector. The whole time that they're there, they're kind of like in competition with each other, like for the final 5 spots. You know, like there are physical people, and then physical magicians, and then there are also like more like psychological ones, which is where the craziness of the book really happens, is like the interplay between like the psychological characters, like manipulations, and the physical magic characters, like being able to, like, they're seen as like more powerful, but it's like, who is really more powerful? I mean, it's like, it's mind-boggling in like some spots, and very skillfully done with like multiple narratives. And I'm excited. It ends on a cliffhanger, so, I mean, fair warning for anyone who's considering reading it. And I am eager to read the next one when it comes out. Next, I read The Chosen and the Beautiful, which was a retelling of The Great Gatsby, from a queer immigrant perspective. So basically, this book takes the character of Jordan Baker, who obviously is not like not a huge part of like the Great Gatsby like main story, and they give her like a different identity. She was brought back from like Vietnam, essentially, like by an English or American like missionary, and then the missionary like subsequently died and left her as like a ward of her parents. So, you know, like she was basically raised by like grandparent age people who were more prominent in society. It was like a judge and his wife, who was more of like a socialite. And eventually, you know, like that was not a great situation for her. She's kind of always an outsider. Her family was like very strict. And eventually she ends up moving to New York to stay with like a more like distant relative of the family, who is a socialite herself, but like much more of like a liberal. And she has known Daisy Buchanan like all of her life. So instead of just being like Nick's, you know, like someone who's interacting with Nick, it takes the perspective of showing her relationship to Daisy like way more than the original story does. You get to see a lot more of Daisy as a character. You get to see a lot less of Jay as a character. That being said, they also make Jordan Baker's character like bisexual as well, which I feel like was an intriguing like aspect, just because they kind of like tease at her like attraction to like multiple characters, or like just being able to like comment on like their allure as people, which I feel like was kind of an interesting point. Something that the original book, I feel like people have like discussed, you know, like Nick being like potentially attracted to like Gatsby as well. So I feel like that kind of makes sense, because it's like this is the author's like kind of take on that scenario. This book was trying to do too many things at once, if I'm being completely honest. I think that like the main story was interesting. Obviously I love The Great Gatsby. I love F. Scott Fitzgerald. I've read multiple books of his, and like a couple of short stories. I feel close to the story, and like maybe that is part of the problem. The most intriguing parts of this book were so far from the story of The Great Gatsby that I'm not sure like why she even bothered like introducing that as like a main storyline. There are like fantasy elements of the story, including like paper cutting, Asian folklore related to like paper cutting and like that coming to life and having like a life of its own, which I have read about in other books, but not in some time. And then it also had like kind of some demon stuffs like brought in, which was also a little bit strange, just because it wasn't like fully fleshed out. Like the idea of like selling someone's soul which is how she explained like Gatsby's riches. I don't know, it seemed like there was too many things going on. There wasn't enough commonalities threaded through, and in a lot of ways, I feel like the Great Gatsby storyline was just kind of like adding on to stuff that already existed. So I would be interested to read this author, her like more original work, especially since I did think the writing was good, her ideas were good. It was just like, she was just trying to do too many things. Okay, next I read Defy the Knight by Brigid Kemmerer. And okay, this book I really liked as well. I would say I bought it from like the Barnes & Noble like sale that they had like at the end of the year to get rid of like all of their hard like cover books. And I decided to just buy this one having not read it because I like loved A Curse So Dark and Lonely and the Cursebreaker series. So much when I read it, so the same author. And this was her new release from the fall. And it's an entirely different world, still fantasy, but it's kind of like, it is supposedly not written after the pandemic, but it is a pandemic book. Which, I mean, maybe I'm just too close to a pandemic right now and I'm not like here for this kind of storyline. It's kind of like Robin Hood-ish, where the main character is a girl named Tessa, whose family, she used to, with her family, take medicine and distribute it to like kind of the poor in the hopes of helping stem like the spread of this like pandemic that is, you know, destroying her realm or destroying her like city. There is a cure for it and a preventative medicine that people can take, but the amount is very controlled. There's a lot of like court politics wrapped up in it, and as a result, like the rich have like way greater access to like being able to keep safe than like the poor people do. So she herself like has kind of like a healer background because of her family. And at the beginning of the story, you realize that her family has died, basically trying to advance like this personal mission. And she has since taken up kind of like her family's mantle with the help of this other outlaw who she doesn't know his actual identity. And then the story is also split with the perspective of like younger prince of the realm, who is basically, I don't know, more of an enforcer for like his brother, as opposed to, I mean, he's not the king. And so you see kind of like the official stance versus like the everyman stance. So you can see like both sides of the coin and how, you know, like various different people are dealing with the pandemic and the politics surrounding like who gets to be safe from the pandemic, etc. This book, it was just like not as engaging, I feel like, as A Curse So Dark and Lonely. I probably would have liked this more if I had read it without having like fallen in love with or been taken by A Curse So Dark and Lonely as much. And I think that because of the pandemic being like a factor like in my life right now, I think that is also probably why I didn't like this book as much. Still liked it. I would still say it was like a 4-star read for me. It just did not stand out, and I feel like I was kind of expecting it to stand out. Like, there was a lot of core politics. It was kind of hard to follow, especially seeing as how like I'm very used to reading that kind of thing, and it wasn't like landing as well for me. And it was supposed to be like kind of twist and turny, but I saw like all of it coming. So next, I read Neon Gods by Katee Robert. Okay, this book I read because on Instagram, like literally no one will shut up about this book. And eventually I was like, okay, I have to read it. I was honestly just like pretty underwhelmed by like this book. It is, you know, it's like a spicier read. It's supposed to be, you know, like sexy, hot, and it is a retelling of Hades and Persephone and like their myth. That being said, oh, and it's supposed to be like a reimagining of Mount Olympus, like where it seems to be like a few generations down the line, kind of weirdly. So if like Zeus like kept having kids, like eventually this would be like his heir that's in charge. So it's like, it's not the original, it's not like the OG Olympus, but but it's like they all have kind of similar personalities, and like they've been carrying on like as their parents have before them. And it's like more modern, so like they have phones and stuff. There was not enough fantasy for me. There was not enough like background, like world building. There was just like a lot of things that were like thrown in, and because it was like a romance book, you were supposed to like not really care. Well, for me, I think I just need more in that department. And that being said, like the spicier scenes were not my style either. Like I think it was a lot of, I don't know, like tall, brooding man who like you think is supposed to be like kind of like rough on the outside and like more commanding, but instead he's like, you know, supposed to be like soft, and you're like, once you get to know him, he's like way sweeter. I don't know. I'm just like, I don't buy it. Well, I do love a fantasy, and I do like enjoy some spicy scenes like thrown in there. Like for me, that is like way less important, or it should be like way minor of a thing. And I prefer like the actual like plot line to exist in like the fantasy world to be like fully fleshed out. And then like that to be kind of like sprinkled in. Next, I have Before the Coffee Gets Cold. And this one I read as like a recommendation from like a bunch of other like booktubers who did not recommend it to me personally, but I just kind of like saw it making the rounds, and I was like, I'm gonna read this because it looks intriguing. It was a short story collection translated from the original Japanese. And basically this book followed a bunch of different characters who all work or interact in this like cafe where one seat allows the person to travel back in time. And there are a bunch of like rules that they have to follow. The main one being that like nothing about the past can actually change. So it's just like being able to like go back, what would you do? Or like why would you choose to go back if you know that everything would be the same? So then there's like a few different examples of like why people might use this power, and you know like how it helped them or like how it hurt them, and how it like affected their life. Honestly, it was really good. I feel like this was the first short story collection that I read where everything actually like connected in the same way. I feel like I have read a fair amount of short story collections, and they end up like not really being related to each other, whereas this one, it was like different story, like it had different characters that were like the main focus, but at the same time like all the characters interwove throughout the whole book, which I feel like was really cool. Next, I read The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer, and this book was pretty interesting. It was a little bit like shove it down your throat like white feminism, which I would say could be damaging, but at the same time, like it was a critique of it. So, you know, if that's your vibe, it is fiction. But it's like the story is very reflective, and it will kind of like force you to like think about things in ways that you might not have before. But basically it follows the story of like a girl who she meets this older feminist woman at college, and when she graduates, she gets the opportunity to like work for this organization that she's started to run in like, you know, the second phase of her career. And she, you know, has been dating this guy since she was like in high school, and since they've had like this like long distance relationship that has been like kind of disillusioning, I would say, because it's like they keep expecting to like be able to spend more time together, and it like keeps like not working out. And so she gets this opportunity to work at this organization, which she kind of like jumps on, and it talks a lot about like female mentorship and like, you know, the idea of like nonprofits, like are they inherently good, like who are they actually helping, like the larger they get, like the less helpful like they really are to like the people who they set out to help in the first place. A lot of like the critiques that you hear about like the second wave feminism now, and like where do people who like, you know, did so much work for the advancement of women like back in the days of like the ERA, like how do they fit in like to the current landscape. I don't know, it was very intriguing. It was pretty good. There was like this whole section in the middle, which I don't want to spoil, but it also like completely threw me for a loop. It was like not what I was expecting the story to go, or like in the direction I was expecting the story to go. And I feel like because of that, it was like a smart move, just because it really like turned everything on its head, and it allowed like the characters to progress in a way that I feel like would not have been possible otherwise. I'll leave it at that. Okay. Next we have Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This was my second book by her, and I will say, in comparison to my extreme loving reaction of like Daisy Jones and the Six, I feel like this one was only okay. Like, you know, like a 4 out of 5. Like, it was good, it was intriguing, I cared about the characters, but at the same time, like, they didn't feel like as dear to me or like as intriguing, and like I'm not sure, they didn't feel as innovative enough, I guess, or it didn't feel like as raw like as the other one. So I'm not sure, maybe it was just I'm not like as super into like a family drama like type storyline. So possibly that is it. But, you know, it's 4 kids who had like a relatively rough upbringing despite having like a famous dad. Just because he was like not really involved in their life. And their mother, as a result, was like very depressed, was like an alcoholic, and died like when they were like pretty young. Thus they've had like they have become like very closely knit as like a group. But they have some secrets, you know, and their dynamics are like strained because of the way that like they grew up and everything. But they always have this like one party to like end the summer with, and the story basically starts in like that timeline leading up to the party, and then it like flashes back to show kind of like the backstory of how things have gotten to like where they are. I feel like I was expecting a little bit more, but there was like nothing wrong with this book, and I did enjoy it. I just didn't enjoy it as much as Daisy Jones and the Six. Next I read The Proxy Marriage, which this is like a little bit strange because it's not like a full book. It is a short story that I read like on recommendation, and it was covered in the podcast that I think it's run by the New York Times, but this short story was originally published in the New Yorker, and they basically have every episode of this podcast, they have one author come on and read a short story of their choosing and then like talk about it with the host. So, and my friend listened to it and suggested that I listen to it as well. So I did. And basically this is a short story about 2 kids who are like seniors in high school or something. And post like 9/11, they start doing like proxy marriages for like military service members who are getting like deployed and their fiancés. I think it's like Montana, I want to say, like is the only state that allows both people to be proxies in a marriage and have it like legally bound. So one of the characters, Bridie, her father is the reverend, I think, of the town, and he asks like Bridie and her friend, who is like madly in love with her and like won't say anything, to basically stand in as proxies for this couple who wrote to him, who wanted to get married, and, you know, like the husband was away. So he basically, William, the boy, is like, oh, I see this as an opportunity to, you know, like kind of get past like my I don't know, like my intense desire to like date this girl, by, you know, like getting to like marry her as like a proxy, but also like being able to use that as like a way to like distance myself. And the story kind of like takes place over a number of years. And so you kind of see like their relationship changing as they do all of these like proxy weddings. I don't know, it was interesting. I feel like it was probably another situation where I could have felt closer to the characters, I think, than I ended up feeling for them. And maybe it was just because they weren't like as likable, and so I didn't necessarily, maybe I didn't like necessarily like sympathize with them as much, either character, if I'm being completely honest. I think it's because I like didn't really see the allure of like Bridie as a romantic lead. Yeah, that was probably it. I feel like she was like not very likable, and I couldn't understand like why William was like so hung up on her in the first place. I would say like I liked it, but I wasn't like blown away by it. Okay, next I read Orlando by Virginia Woolf, which I love Virginia Woolf. Like, I'm gonna come right out and say it. She's like one of my favorite authors. I've read multiple books by her. I feel like I have like subconsciously tried to like space out like my reading of her just because I know like I love it so much and eventually I'm gonna run out. And then I'll only be able to like reread, which feels sad already, like thinking about it. But I read this book with like a bunch of my friends who, some of them liked it, some of them did not. And I will freely admit that like this book is a little bit strange. And it is very different, I would say, from her other books, which are definitely like more realistic, more realist, I should say. This one is like, it's definitely got like some fantasy elements. Not all of it like makes sense or like follows like a specific storyline that you would expect from a person who normally writes about like, you know, women in the in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But that being said, it's like a, you know, it is like a feminist like iconic book that talks about like gender roles, like identity, gender identity, you know, like what's in a name, like personal quest for like like the personal meaning. I don't know. It was just really good. So basically, you know, it's a quote biography. It's kind of like a literary genre critique, where you're basically getting the life story of the main character Orlando, who in the beginning of the book is a man, or like a young boy, I should say, or you know, like a young man, who is like a page for like Queen Elizabeth, like in her court. So like during like Shakespearean times, and he is basically able to like move through time. So at like a certain point, you realize it's like 100 years later, and the book is kind of like broken up into like 4 different chunks across 4 different centuries. And in the beginning half of the book, Orlando is a man, and then there is a shift where he switches gender and becomes female. She has dalliances, there are like romantic tensions, there is a lot of discussion of like attraction, how it's separate from gender. There's a lot of talk about clothing and like how like Orlando, the character, uses clothing to express their gender and how they are currently feeling in terms of like freedom to express like that gender, which is also really cool. Even though the storyline is, I feel like, not really what Virginia Woolf writes in general. If you have read any of her other work, her tone, I feel like, is very similar. It's like very characteristic like of her, like a little bit like tongue-in-cheek, like kind of snarky at parts, like doing asides to like the readers, which like I love. So you feel very like called, like as the reader, like reading the book, like she sees you, she's writing it like to you, and like you're kind of like sharing in on the joke like with her as she's writing it. But yes, very much enjoyed it. And I will always look forward to reading like more Virginia Woolf in the future. And I wish that everyone would give her a chance because she's amazing. Next, I read Girlhood by Melissa Febos. Girlhood by Melissa Febos, which this was a collection of essays, personal essays, that I also read on a recommendation and like with other friends. This book was like a lot darker than I was expecting, honestly. I was expecting it, I mean, like it's definitely labeled as kind of, you know, a person like going back and looking at like their childhood trauma that like they experience as like a woman. You know, it's like intersectional feminism, so she's like a queer person of color, and reflecting back on her experience in like definitely a lower income area, like as a young woman who didn't necessarily have like access to like a mother that had the time to like help her like work through all of this stuff like at that moment. So that being said, I feel like I was expecting it to be like a little traumatic, and it was way more than I was expecting. So definitely like look at the trigger warnings before you read this. But overall, I did enjoy it. The essays, I feel like I liked the way that they were written. They kind of, they were a little bit more like stream of consciousness. She tended to weave in more like literary theory or like other books, other like narratives. She kind of like related those into her own personal story, which I feel like was helpful for the reader, because a lot of times like in a personal essay type thing, they are talking a lot about their experience, which can be very entertaining and like very intriguing and capturing of like the reader's attention. But at the same time, they can be distancing if you don't necessarily like identify with something that the character is like, or that the author is trying to tell you. So this book, I feel like, did a good job of pulling the reader in by like weaving in these stories that were like much more relatable to like a more privileged person, I should say, because me being that privileged person, I didn't share a lot of like the experiences with her, and this tactic that she used helped me to kind of get down into like the more like nitty gritty level of like what she was writing about. So I really enjoyed that. And there was this one short story that she wrote. I feel like there was two of them that I really liked. One of them was about her time in Paris, which I think I could relate a little bit more to her, in that she was writing about like being like kind of nearing the end of her school career, and like kind of like being disillusioned with like becoming an adult or like feeling lost, which I feel like that part did speak to me a little bit. And then there was also one about like platonic cuddle parties, which I feel like was just kind of like a crazy like, I don't know, topic to write about. Although obviously it was about way more than that, but that was kind of like the comedic like insertion, or like more relatable aspect of the story. And then she was like talking a lot about like her relationship to like touch and like the power dynamics like related to that, and like, you know, women being accustomed to like being touched without like their consent, or without their express consent, I should say. So I mean, like, I guess that's an example of like her comparing like these two different things, or like using like a more approachable topic to unpack something that's like much more like deep-seated, personal, and like more controversial. I did enjoy it. I thought it was great. But yes, if you are thinking about reading it and you're worried about you know, like the content being triggering, I would definitely look at it, because as I said, I went into it expecting it to be like, you know, this level, and it was like, okay. And the last book I read was Cobble Hill by Cecily von Ziegesar, who is the author of Gossip Girl, which is why I picked up this book during the Barnes & Noble hardcover sale. And I would say, largely, I was like very underwhelmed. I was like expecting it to be like way more like salacious, like juicy, gossipy, and it was like not. The story was like, you know, following a bunch of different characters who like all live in the same neighborhood, and like that was the only thing about them that was like related to each other. It was like super bizarre. The characters, I wasn't really attached to like any of them. It wasn't a romance. It wasn't like a breakup story. Like, I don't know. It wasn't a coming of age novel, even though there were like some kids, there were some older adults. And like, I feel like I was expecting there to be something that tied everyone together, and like nothing did. There was like one block party that was like, I don't know, could have been that moment where like a romantic comedy and like everyone runs in together and you're like, oh, now I understand why they're all in the same movie. But other than that, like, there was literally no reason and nothing happened. So I don't know. I feel like I was just so underwhelmed. So, I mean, it was a little bit disappointing, I would say. But at the same time, also a really short read. And if you like a book about nothing, like, at least the characters were like kind of intriguing, or like had some like, you know, unique aspects to them. So like it could be intriguing from that perspective. But overall, and that was the last one. So overall, I had a pretty good reading month. I would say that don't expect as many books next time. You will all have been spoiled by me having like way more time this month than usual. But anyways, this was great, and if you liked the video, please like and comment if you have read any of the books, or, you know, are interested in reading some of the books, or if you have any suggestions based off of like how I felt about these books for something for me to read like next week, or next month, I mean. And otherwise, I will see you all next week. All right, bye.